Thank you. I would like to thank for the opportunity to come here and give this presentation. And my title is it justified to run an ECMO service in a small geographically isolated situation in an area? And I know some of you work in centers in Europe or outside of Europe where you feel isolated, but perhaps not as geographically isolated as Iceland is. So most of you are very familiar with the ECMO setup, which is a modified form of cardiopulmonary bypass that can prove life-saving in severe respiratory and/or cardiac failure that is refractory to conventional treatment. It can either be provided as a veno-venous or a veno-arterial method. So the VV ECMO, the veno-venous ECMO, was first reported in the early 70s, and the indications are potentially reversible severe respiratory failure, bridge to lung transplantation, and in rare occasions, severe air leak. Very briefly, it's about putting in large bore cannula into the systemic circulation, transporting it to a pump where the blood is oxygenated, CO2 removed, and then put back into the venous circulation. The VA ECMO is similar unless the blood is pumped back into the arterial circulations, and it is indicated in cardiac failure or in shock situation, which is usually fulminant myocarditis, acute MI, post-cardiotomy, such as after complex heart surgeries of different kinds, sepsis-induced cardiomyopathy, massive pulmonary embolism, refractory cardiac arrest, bridge to heart transplantation, and in rare occasions as a ventricular assist device following heart transplantation. There has been enormous technical advances over the years, especially in the last decade, in ECMO machines and cannulas. And this one, for instance, from the CardioHelp is only 11.5 kilos and is transportable to the PCI unit from the operating room and even into the ICU. So VV ECMO is now used worldwide, and as I told you, the first cases were in the early 70s, and the results were not very good. And there were actually several studies showing that this method should possibly be abandoned. But in 2009, this famous paper was published in the Lancet called the CESAR trial, and it showed the benefit of VV ECMO instead of just respirator treatment for these patients. It was criticized because almost 80% patients in the ECMO arm did not receive ECMO after randomization, but still it showed that the survival for the ECMO group was 63% versus 47%. From 1991, according to the ELSO registry, the numbers of centers that are providing ECMO has increased from 86 in 91 until 329 in 2016. And you can see that the cases are almost 10,000 that have been treated annually now. So some facts about Iceland. It's only 100,000 square kilometers. There are 330,000 inhabitants, so it's just like almost like a small city in Germany. But we have very advanced healthcare system that we are proud of. It's a single-payer one. It's available to all, totally free. And there are no private hospitals. And as an indicator of that the system is working, that we have the lowest perinatal mortality in the world, and longevity among both males and females is among the highest in the world. And just to remind you that Iceland won over Turkey 3-0 yesterday in soccer. So we are not totally bad. But there is a challenge living in a country like Iceland. We have 4 cardiothoracic surgeons and 3 perfusionists in Iceland. We have all been trained overseas. I was 12 years in Sweden and America, and my colleagues as well. And we have to fix the problems on our own. Here you see the shortest flight distances to other centers providing ECMO. It's about 3 hours flight to Stockholm or to Sahlgrenska, 2.5 hours to Oslo, and 2 hours and 5 minutes to Glasgow. So these distances are simply too long if you have advanced situation where the patient is not transportable. On the other way, it takes 5 hours to Boston and 5.5 to 6 hours to New York. So we have to solve the problems on our own, and actually in Iceland we are providing most of all cardiothoracic service for our inhabitants, except cardiac transplantations and VIDs that we send to Sahlgrenska and Gothenburg. Other cases are, and complex congenital surgery that are class 2 or class 3, they are sent to Gothenburg as well, or Lund actually. But the interesting question is, how is the outcome of ECMO, and especially VV ECMO, connected to volumes? And there is this paper that was published in the American Journal of Respiratory Critical Care in 2015, and it showed that mortality for adults and neonates between 1989 and 2013 was lower at hospitals with higher ECMO volumes. However, there was a subgroup analysis of adults on VV ECMO between 2008 and 2013, and it showed no association between volume and outcome. But the question, of course, is for us in Iceland, if it is justified to do the service. We started in 1991, which was very early, and I do a lot of lectures in Europe, mostly about our medical school and our medical system, as it is the smallest medical school in Europe, with 48 graduates per year. And people tell me, it's crazy for you guys to run an ECMO service. You have too low volumes, but we don't agree, and we have to support this by doing our own studies. So the aims of this study was to look for the indication in Iceland and how the outcome was, mainly for VV ECMO, but I will also present preliminary data for our VA ECMO. And it's a single center study, of course, whole nation, and these were all patients treated between 1991 and 2016 for the VV ECMO and until 2009 for the VA ECMO. And we looked on all of these charts, and we have 100% follow-up of all the patients. And the ECMO setup at our centers is installed in the OR. It's a CT surgeon who puts up the lines, and there is a perfusist and an ICU team available and present. And we use heparin-coated cannulas, and there's anticoagulation with unfractionated heparin, and we are aiming at a saturation of 80% with normal capnia and normal serum lactate and in a lung rest ventilation. So these are the VV ECMO demographics and indications. There were 16 patients, 7 females and 9 males, aged 35 years. All of them had ARDS, and here you see the reason. There were 3 swine influenza patients and 2 near drownings, but most often following pneumonia. And here you see in blue the VV ECMOs in Iceland from the start in 1991, when we did 2 cases, one VA ECMO and one VV ECMO. And just to make it clear, the red ones are the VA ECMOs at the same time. They were 40, and the other were 17. And as you can see, there's a drastic increase in the last 10 years of this treatment. 1/3 VV ECMO, 2/3 VA ECMO. And here are the results. Time on respirator prior to ECMO, 3 days. Murray score was 3.5, Apache score 20, and the duration of ECMO was between 2 and 40 days with a median of 9.5 days. There were some complications, and 44% needed concurrent hemodialysis for AKI, and there were 1 patient with hemopneumothorax and 5 patients with major bleedings. And 4 technical problems, including 2 where the oxygenator failed, but these problems could be solved with survival of the patients. So out of these 16 patients, 10 were weaned off ECMO and survived to discharge, and to our surprise, all of them are still alive and doing great. And these are the results here again. But when we compare our results to much bigger studies like the ELSO registry, we see that our survival data is in line with that. And it was 58% survival to discharge in the ELSO from 2017. In our Swedish study, 73%. And then there are 2 Australian studies by Smith and Obron that show survival around 61 and 62%. So we are at least not doing worse than most of the comparative studies. Now back to the VA ECMO very shortly. These are preliminary results. We have analyzed most of the data for all of the patients, but I will show you here the first 17 patients. The age is a little bit higher, and these patients were mostly post-cardiotomy or after cardiac arrest. We had 8 patients after cardiac arrest with no survivors, and the survival was 35%. And the reason of death in these patients that did not survive the treatment was multi-organ failure, cerebral edema, cardiac failure, sepsis, and MI. But the interesting thing is to look at this year. This is preliminary data from 2017 for the first 8 months in Iceland. And here you can see that we have done 12 cases so far. And in several occasions we have been asked to come down to the PCI lab and install the ECMO there. And actually it's interesting, there are 2 VV ECMOs, but 10 of these are VA ECMOs. And 4 out of 10 did not survive the treatment and 6 did not. So this is a clear increase in indication. So the question arises, if we are using this, if we are to loosen our indications, because some of these survivors are brain death, actually. We are not doing them any benefit by this treatment. So we have to rethink about our indications, and it's like they say in America, if you have a new hammer, everything looks like a nail. You are hammering all these patients with the same hammer. So we have to improve our indications and think about the patient selections. It would be interesting in Iceland to follow up these patients regarding quality of life, which is, of course, important. But the conclusion is that it is possible to run a service like this, even though it's geographically isolated, and our results are comparable to larger centers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. This was the first of 3 abstract presentations. Are there any questions? I've got a question regarding the funding. How was the funding organized for your ECMO service? Was that a problem, or is that easy to be part of your health system?
Yeah, actually, I don't dare to say it, but we have 4 ECMO machines in Iceland, and we didn't even ask for them. Because when the swine influenza occurred in Europe and the world, the Icelandic government decided to have extra much ECMO service present.
Right.
So we can actually run ECMO on 4 patients concurrently. We have not done that, but all of our 3 patients that were treated with ECMO and swine influenza survived, and these were young females. So the funding is no problem in Iceland as it is governmental-based single-payer system. So we are in a different situation in that way. But of course it could be criticized that we are using a lot of money on these patients, but still almost half of them are surviving. Yeah. And if we wouldn't provide it in Iceland, these patients would all die. They are not transportable to other countries as they are.
There's a question there.
Yes, my name is Walter Wildevuur. I'm a perfusionist. I think you have very good results, but my question is, how long of a time did you take before you started this program with training the people and so on? Because I think that is quite important.
Yes, thank you. That's a quick question. All of our surgeons and our perfusionists are trained overseas. So we learned on these techniques in our training overseas before returning back to Iceland. And some of my colleagues have huge experience with ECMO. But of course we had to train our personnel in the ICU, the nurses and so on. But when we have an ECMO patient in our clinic, which is small, much smaller than your clinics, there is a perfusionist in house all the time. So the perfusionist is a key person in our service, and they have to be congratulated for the good outcome. So they have to stay overnight in house when there is ECMO going.
Tomas, Valpod Geneva, thank you for a very nice overview and good results. Did you have any, I saw you had 2 drownings, did you have some linked with hypothermia or deep hypothermic patients also?
Yes, we had, in some cases they are defined as arrhythmia or so, but actually there are 2 patients with hypothermia, but we don't have any huge experience like you have in Switzerland or the Tromsø group in north of Norway. And this came a little bit to our surprise because it's cold in Iceland and the water are cold, but people stay in the geothermal hot pots, you know. Okay. But actually we get people from the Blue Lagoon, you know, they swallow the water and it gets into the lung, and there were at least 2 of them defined as drowning in the Blue Lagoon. So be careful when you come to Iceland.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you again, Thomas. And I've got a thank you token for you. Thank you.